The vault. Somebody rented a storage locker in Burbank, California, under a stolen name, paid every bill in cash, and never once came back for what was inside. For 3 decades, that metal door stayed shut. Nobody opened it, nobody asked about it, and nobody had any idea what was sitting behind it. That changed in 1991, when a 28-year-old man named Mark Horonick received a bill in the mail for $365, charged to a storage unit he had never heard of, at a facility he had never visited. His identity had been stolen to open the account, and when the storage company called the police, what they found behind that door sent shockwaves through Hollywood. A trumpet, an antique record player, a jukebox loaded with a song that once topped the Billboard Hot 100, boxes of personal clothing, stacks of private photographs, and documents that were never meant to see daylight. Every single item belonged to a man who had been dead for barely a year, a man who had danced his way into America's living rooms, fought his way into Hollywood's inner circle, loved women he was told he could never touch, and died with nothing left except a name the entire world recognized. That man was Sammy Davis Jr., and the contents of that locker told a story far bigger than stolen memorabilia. They told the story of the greatest entertainer America ever produced, and the country that consumed his talent without ever truly accepting him. To understand how those possessions ended up hidden in a concrete box under a stranger's name, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Born into the spotlight, Sammy Davis Jr. arrived on December 8, 1925, in the heart of Harlem, New York City. His father, Sammy Davis Sr., danced in vaudeville acts for a living, and his mother, Ella Sanchez, performed on the same circuit. From his very first breath, the stage was already pulling him in. But there was something about his family that stayed buried for decades. His mother was Cuban. Today, that wouldn't raise an eyebrow, but in 1920s America, being black already painted a target on your back. Layering Cuban heritage on top of that created the kind of risk nobody in the family wanted to take, so they buried it. They never spoke about Ella's roots publicly, because in a country obsessed with putting people in boxes based on skin color, giving anyone an extra reason to push you down was a gamble that wasn't worth the cost. Harlem, in the late 1920s, was electric, buzzing with the energy of the Harlem Renaissance, with jazz pouring out of every window and ambition filling every street corner. Somewhere in the middle of all that energy, a toddler was learning how to work a crowd. By the age of 2, Sammy was already performing with the Will Maston Trio, a vaudeville act run by his father and a family friend named Will Maston, and while other children his age were still figuring out how to walk in a straight line, Sammy was figuring out how to hold an audience. There were no school days, no classrooms, no recess bells. His education came from the road itself, mile after mile, city after city, theater after cramped theater. Books he found along the way taught him to read. The musicians he toured with taught him instruments. Languages came from strangers in strange towns. Everything Sammy knew, he figured out on his own, squeezed in between shows and bus rides and hotel lobbies that sometimes refused to let him through the front door. That was the contradiction of being a black child performer in the 1930s and 1940s. Stages welcomed you with open arms while the rest of America slammed the door shut. Sammy saw the signs everywhere he went, the ones that read whites only at diners, at water fountains, at hotels. Old enough to perform for white audiences, but never old enough in their eyes to sit beside them. That contradiction planted something inside him early, a kind of fire that burned quietly and never went out. A child with no childhood. When Sammy turned 3, his parents separated, and his father took custody. From that point forward, the road became the only life he knew. Will Maston stepped into a larger role, part mentor, part protector, part second father, and the trio kept traveling, kept performing, kept surviving. Sammy kept getting better at a speed that startled everyone around him. By the age of 7, Hollywood noticed. In 1933, Sammy appeared in a short film called Rufus Jones for President, acting alongside the great Ethel Waters in a story that dared to imagine a young black boy dreaming of the highest office in the land. The premise was played for laughs, but underneath the comedy sat something quietly radical for its time. A black child on screen imagining a future that America told him he could never have. Sammy was magnetic in every frame. His timing landed sharp and clean, and his smile carried a warmth that made you forget everything else in the room. That was the gift that would define his entire career. The ability to make people stop seeing color, even if only for a few minutes. It would carry him further than anyone predicted, and it would cost him more than anyone should ever have to pay. The Army years. Everything shifted in 1943. The world was at war, and America needed bodies. Sammy was 18 years old, 5'6", 120 pounds soaking wet, a performer who had never thrown a punch in his life. None of that mattered to the draft board. They shipped him off to the United States Army, and what happened during those years remains one of the most disturbing chapters in his entire story, the chapter that explains everything that came after. Sammy's assignment landed him in one of the first integrated units in the military. On paper, that sounded like progress. Black and white soldiers serving together for the first time. The reality was a different thing entirely. The very first soldier Sammy encountered called him a racial slur, not behind his back, straight to his face, and the abuse never let up from that moment forward. His nose was broken 3 separate times. Groups of white soldiers jumped him because apparently one-on-one wasn't enough against a 5'6" dancer who weighed less than most of their rucksacks. One night, a group of them grabbed him and painted his entire body white, head to toe, and stood around laughing at the result. Turning a black man white was the funniest thing they had ever seen. Another time, they handed him a beer and watched him drink it, then told him it was laced with urine. And then came a night that would scar him for the rest of his life. Soldiers tied him to a tree in freezing temperatures and left him there alone. Anyone who knows American history understands what it means to tie a black man to a tree. The symbolism wasn't accidental, it was a message, delivered deliberately and received in silence by every officer who chose to look the other way. One beating landed Sammy in the hospital for 3 full days. The injuries came from men wearing the same uniform, men who were supposed to be on his side, and not a single one of them faced discipline. Lying in that hospital bed, bruised and broken, Sammy stared at the ceiling and thought about ending everything. The hatred, the isolation, the sheer weight of it nearly crushed him flat. What pulled him back was a transfer to the Army's entertainment unit. The moment he stepped onto a stage again, something shifted in the room. Even the soldiers who had beaten him went quiet when he performed. Their fists unclenched, their jaws relaxed, and the same hands that had hurt him started clapping. Sammy understood something in that moment that he carried for the rest of his life. His talent wasn't just a gift, it was armor, and nobody on earth could strip it from him. The boy who walked into the Army as a performer walked out as something else entirely, a man who had stared into the worst of human nature and come through the other side with his spirit bruised but unbroken. Every performance he gave from that point forward carried the weight of those years, whether the audience knew it or not. The night, everything changed. Sammy came home from the military a different man, harder and hungrier than the kid who had left. The moment that cracked open his career happened in March of 1951 at Cyro's, the most glamorous nightclub on Sunset Boulevard. The Will Maston Trio had been booked to open for singer Janice Page. A solid gig, nothing historic. And then the Academy Awards ceremony ended that same evening, and Hollywood's biggest names flooded into the club. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Cary Grant, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, they all packed into that room, drink in hand, expecting a decent warm-up act. What they got instead was a detonation. Sammy didn't perform that night. He erupted. Singing, dancing, impressions, instruments, comedy, all of it pouring out of him with a ferocity that left the most famous people in the world standing on their feet. By the time the sun came up, the phone started ringing, and it did not stop. Bookings flooded in from every direction. An appearance on Eddie Cantor's television show followed in 1952, along with a $20,000 pilot deal from ABC, something virtually unheard of for a black entertainer in that era. No sponsor backed the pilot, and it never aired. But the offer alone told a story that mattered more than any television show. Sammy Davis Jr. had arrived, and nobody in Hollywood could pretend otherwise. The kid from Harlem who had never set foot in a classroom, who had learned everything he knew from back roads and backstage hallways, was now the most talked-about entertainer in the country. Ciro's became his launchpad, and the trajectory from that night forward pointed straight up. The crash and the conversion. 3 years of momentum came to a violent stop on November 19, 1954. Sammy was 29, driving his Cadillac down Route 66 from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. At a fork in the road, another car backed into his lane, and the collision drove the cone-shaped center of the steering wheel straight into his left eye. Doctors at the hospital couldn't save it. The eye was gone. Hollywood held its breath. A performer built on movement, energy, and physical connection with an audience. Losing an eye seemed like the end. Friends rallied around him, with Frank Sinatra visiting constantly, and offers for performances poured in at triple his previous rate. Not from pity, but from curiosity. The world wanted to see if Sammy Davis Jr. was really as unstoppable as the legend suggested. 8 weeks later, he gave them the answer. Walking back onto the stage at Ciro's, the same club where he had first stunned Hollywood, Sammy brought the house down all over again. One fewer eye and twice the determination. An eye patch came first, then a glass eye, and in true Sammy fashion, he refused to let the tragedy stay tragic. He cracked jokes about it, calling himself a one-eyed Negro who's also Jewish. That last part caught people off guard. During his recovery, Sammy had started reading about Judaism. Eddie Cantor had given him a mezuzah and spoken to him about resilience, about a people who had endured persecution for centuries and refused to vanish. Something in that story struck a nerve deep inside Sammy's chest. His own life was reflected in it, the suffering, the survival, the stubborn refusal to be erased. Formal conversion came in 1960. Plenty of people mocked him for it. Sammy paid them no attention. Being black and Jewish wasn't a contradiction in his mind, it was a double dose of survival, and he wore both identities with pride for the rest of his life. The love that nearly killed him. By the late 1950s, Sammy's career was soaring. Sold-out crowds, the biggest names in entertainment calling him a friend, one of the most recognizable faces in America. But behind closed doors, a love story was unfolding that could have gotten him killed. Sammy met Kim Novak in 1957. She was one of Hollywood's biggest movie stars, blonde, glamorous, and under contract with Columbia Pictures. Their paths crossed on The Steve Allen Show, and the attraction was immediate and mutual. Everything had to stay secret, because in 1950s America, a black man dating a white woman wasn't simply controversial, it was lethal. Only 4% of Americans approved of interracial relationships at the time. The murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy killed for allegedly whistling at a white woman, had happened just 2 years earlier. Sammy hid under blankets in the back seats of cars to avoid being spotted. They met at a private beach house in Malibu, spent holidays together, and even introduced each other to their families. The relationship was genuine and growing more serious by the week. That changed in January of 1958 when a gossip column published a false report claiming the two were engaged. The reaction was instant and savage. Columbia Pictures panicked over their investment in Kim Novak's image. And then the situation escalated beyond anything a studio could control, because the mob got involved. Men connected to organized crime physically took Sammy and delivered a message that left no room for interpretation. End the relationship with Kim Novak, or lose the one eye you have left. Possibly worse. Even Sam Giancana, one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, told Sammy that he couldn't offer protection inside Hollywood. On January 7, 1958, Sammy ended the relationship against every instinct in his body. 3 days later, on January 10th, he married a black singer named Lorraine White in what amounted to a staged performance for the mob and the press. Reports suggest he paid her up to $25,000. The marriage collapsed within 3 months. That night, after the ceremony, Sammy lost control entirely. His assistant later found him alone in a room with a gun. The love story with Kim Novak didn't fade away. It was destroyed, crushed by an industry, a criminal enterprise, and a country that could not tolerate two human beings loving each other across a color line. Marrying May Britt. Sammy did not stop challenging those boundaries. In 1960, he married May Britt, a Swedish actress, and this time there was no hiding. Interracial marriage remained illegal in 31 states at that moment. The couple planned their ceremony at Temple Israel of Hollywood, but bomb threats forced them to relocate to Sammy's home in the Hollywood Hills. Frank Sinatra stood beside him as a witness, and both Sammy and May had already converted to Judaism. The backlash came fast and hard. Swastikas appeared on their property. 20th Century Fox terminated May Britt's contract, deciding overnight that a white actress married to a black man had no market value. A career that had been climbing steadily was gutted in a single stroke. And here is a detail that reveals just how deep the hostility ran. Sammy had campaigned for John F. Kennedy, raised money for his election, stood beside him publicly at events. But when the 1961 inauguration arrived, Sammy received word that he was not welcome. The new president's team calculated that an interracial couple at the celebration would generate too much controversy. The man who helped put a president in office was told to stay home from the party. Sammy and May built a family together despite the pressure. Their daughter Tracy arrived in 1961, and they later adopted 2 sons, Mark and Jeff. They surrounded their children with friends who judged people by character rather than color. But every time those kids stepped outside that protective circle, the real world waited with racial slurs painted on cars and hatred etched into sidewalks. Tracy spoke years later about the whiplash of feeling safe inside their home, then running face first into venom the moment she left it. The marriage lasted 8 years before May filed for divorce in 1968. The public pressure, Sammy's relentless touring schedule, and his affairs, including one with singer Lola Falana, had hollowed the relationship from the inside. But it's fair to wonder how much of that damage was inflicted by a world that never wanted them together in the first place. Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. Running through all of it, the heartbreak, the threats, the violence, was a friendship that shaped Sammy's entire life. Frank Sinatra met Sammy in 1941, when Sammy was just 15 years old, performing with the Will Maston Trio at a venue in Detroit. Frank was 26, on tour with Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, and the moment he watched Sammy perform, he recognized something rare and electric. Over the next decade, Frank kept finding quiet ways to push doors open for the younger performer. In 1947, Frank arranged for the Will Maston Trio to open for him at the Capitol Theater in New York City, a booking that bent the arc of Sammy's career in a new direction. Frank didn't stop at professional favors. He fought for Sammy's dignity in rooms where dignity was not extended to black men. In 1950, Sammy was turned away from the Copacabana in New York, refused entry because of his race. Frank's reaction was fury. He told Sammy to show up the following night, and this time Frank walked through the door right beside him, sat at the same table, and made it unmistakably clear that if Sammy wasn't welcome, then neither was Frank Sinatra. He repeated this pattern throughout the 1950s, refusing to play any venue that would not treat Sammy as an equal. When the car accident claimed Sammy's left eye in 1954, Frank covered the hospital bills, brought Sammy to Palm Springs to recover, and delivered the kind of blunt advice that only a true friend can give: get back on stage now, or risk losing everything you've built. No pity, no coddling, just a shove in the right direction. That brotherhood reached its peak with the Rat Pack. Frank, Dean Martin, Sammy, Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford became the coolest group in entertainment, and their 1960 film Ocean's 11 turned all 5 of them into icons. The movie premiered in Las Vegas on August 3rd, earned $5.5 million at the box office, roughly $55 million in today's money, and that final shot of the 5 men walking past a casino marquee with their names on it became one of the most recognizable images in Hollywood history. Sammy was not the sidekick in that group, he was its heartbeat. Las Vegas and the color line. Las Vegas sits at the center of Sammy's story in ways that are both triumphant and deeply painful. By the late 1950s, Sammy ranked among the biggest draws on the entire strip, pulling in as much as $25,000 a week. The city depended on his talent to fill seats and sell drinks, and yet that same city refused to let him sleep in the hotels where he performed. Segregation in Las Vegas during that era was total and unapologetic. Black entertainers sang and danced in the showrooms, then were escorted off the premises and sent to boarding houses on the west side of town, miles from the bright lights. Casino restaurants, gambling floors, and swimming pools were all off limits. Sammy refused to swallow that arrangement quietly. His leverage was simple and powerful. He filled every seat in the house, and empty seats meant lost money. Using that bargaining chip, he became the first black entertainer to receive free room and board at the Frontier Hotel. That cracked the wall. With the Rat Pack backing him, Sammy pressured other casinos to follow, and slowly, grudgingly, the color barriers began to crumble. Full desegregation didn't arrive until 1971, when Nevada passed a law officially ending hotel discrimination, but Sammy was one of the people who made that law necessary. The night he died in 1990, Las Vegas dimmed every light on the Strip for a full minute. The city that once told him he wasn't fit to sleep in its beds paid him the highest tribute it knew how to give. Every marquee went dark, every neon sign blinked off, and for 60 seconds, the loudest, brightest city in America stood in silence for the man who had helped build it into what it became. The entertainment capital of the world owed a debt it could never fully repay to a performer it had once forced to enter through the kitchen. Broadway, Hollywood, and television. Sammy's talent didn't confine itself to nightclubs and casinos. Broadway, Hollywood, and television all felt his presence in ways that left permanent marks. In 1956, Mr. Wonderful opened on Broadway, a show written specifically around Sammy, which was nearly unheard of for a black performer in that decade. Critics savaged it, with the New York Times calling the production loud and mediocre. Audiences ignored the reviews entirely. The show ran for 383 performances, earned back every dollar of its $225,000 budget, and Sammy turned each night into something unique by weaving his nightclub act into the performance. Golden Boy followed in 1964. Sammy played a black boxer who falls in love with a white woman, and when he kissed his white co-star on stage, bomb threats flooded the theater. Death threats arrived by mail. Sammy did not flinch, performed every single show, and earned a Tony nomination for his work. During that same period, he marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama, putting his body on the line for justice both on stage and in the streets. Film roles expanded his reach even further. Anna Lucasta came in 1958, Porgy and Bess in 1959, alongside Sidney Poitier and Dorothy Dandridge, and Rat Pack films like Ocean's 11 and Robin and the Seven Hoods cemented his place in Hollywood. Sweet Charity in 1969 added another layer to a career that seemed to have no ceiling. Television audiences knew him just as well. Regular appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show kept his face in front of millions, and in 1966, NBC launched the Sammy Davis Jr. Show, making him one of the first black entertainers to host a primetime network variety program. Stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton appeared as his guests. Sammy promoted the show with a relentless schedule of dozens of interviews each week, driven by a work ethic that exhausted everyone around him. Singing, dancing, acting, drumming, trumpet, piano, vibraphone, impressions so accurate you'd swear the real person was in the room. Gun tricks, comedy that could crack a room wide open. There was nothing in entertainment that this man could not do. The title Mr. Show Business was not flattery. It was the only phrase that came close to describing what Sammy Davis Jr. actually was. The dark side. Greatness and self-destruction lived side by side inside Sammy for most of his adult life. After his divorce from May Britt in 1968, something cracked. The years of public hatred, the loneliness that no amount of fame could fill, and the pain of yet another broken relationship caught up with him all at once. Cocaine and amyl nitrite became his escape. His Beverly Hills mansion turned into a revolving door of excess, with celebrities showing up at all hours to drink, to party, to disappear into the noise. On stage, the magic held, but offstage, the man was coming apart. Friends watched it happen. Some intervened, but Sammy had spent a lifetime perfecting the performance of pretending everything was fine, and that performance was harder to break through than any of his others. Gambling compounded the damage in ways that were almost hard to believe. $40,000 in a single night at the tables, again and again, with no plan and no restraint. Over the course of his career, Sammy earned roughly $50 million. At his peak, a single performance could bring in $185,000. And yet the money vanished as fast as it arrived, devoured by bad investments, questionable tax shelters, and a generosity that bordered on compulsive. Sammy financially supported dozens of people, many of whom took full advantage of his open wallet. In 1970, he married dancer Altavice Gore, with Reverend Jesse Jackson officiating the ceremony. Altavice brought a measure of stability to his world, but calm was never the word for their life together. Wild parties and persistent rumors followed them wherever they went. They adopted a son, Manny, in 1989, just 1 year before the end. Through the addiction, the chaos, and the slow erosion of everything he had built, Altavice stayed. Sammy eventually managed to quit cocaine. Alcohol stayed with him, and the gambling never stopped. The distance between the dazzling performer the world cheered for and the broken man who went home afterward only grew wider with each passing year. One bright spot arrived in June of 1972 when his version of the Candyman climbed all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, selling over 2 million copies and earning him a gold record. The irony was thick because Sammy had hated the song from the moment he first heard it, but its cheerful melody and his effortless charm won over a new generation of listeners who had never seen him perform live. Meanwhile, I've Gotta Be Me, released in 1968, became his personal anthem, a declaration of identity and defiance that he used to close shows for years. Every performance of that song felt like watching a man tell the whole world exactly who he was and daring them to look away. The final tour, nostalgia brought the world what it had been waiting for in 1987, when Sammy, Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin announced a reunion tour. After all those legendary nights together, the three of them were getting back on stage. They called it the International Farewell Tour, and the scale was unlike anything the Rat Pack had ever attempted. No more intimate nightclub stages. These men booked arenas holding between 10,000 and 25,000 people. a leap that was either bold or reckless depending on who you asked. The first show took place at the Oakland Coliseum on March 13, 1988, and for a few shining moments the old chemistry sparked back to life. But Dean Martin was already 70 years old, and the brutal pace of touring wore him down fast. After just 5 performances, Dean departed the tour, citing health problems. Liza Minnelli stepped in, and the show pushed forward across the United States before heading overseas to Japan, Australia, and Europe. The final curtain came down in May of 1989. Those turned out to be the last performances that generation would ever see from those men together. The diagnosis. A few months after the tour wrapped, in August of 1989, Sammy noticed that food no longer tasted right, and a persistent ache had settled into his throat. Doctors delivered the diagnosis with the bluntness that only terrible news allows: throat cancer. Decades of smoking, up to 4 packs a day during his heaviest years, had done irreversible damage. The doctors laid out 2 paths. Surgeons could remove his larynx and save his life, but he would never speak again, never sing another note. The alternative was radiation therapy, with no guarantees and slim odds. For a man whose voice had carried him out of poverty, through the army, past every barrier America threw at him, the choice was never really a choice at all. Sammy chose radiation. He chose his voice. 8 weeks of brutal treatment followed, the tumor shrank, and hope crept back in. Sammy even returned to the stage a handful of times, feeding off the energy of crowds that loved him. But by early 1990, the cancer had returned and spread too aggressively for anyone to stop. His weight dropped to roughly 60 pounds. The voice that had filled arenas, silenced bullies, and moved an entire nation faded to a whisper. On May 16, 1990, at his home in Beverly Hills, Sammy Davis Jr. died at 64 years old. The cigarettes that had kept him company through all those late-night sessions, after-parties, and marathon performances became the thing that finally silenced him. The money was gone. What followed his death was nearly as painful as losing him. 6 decades in show business and roughly $50 million in career earnings, and Sammy died owing the IRS over $5 million. With penalties and interest factored in, that number swelled to $7 million, the equivalent of roughly $13 million in today's dollars. His estate held about $4 million, and the government seized every cent. Altavice was left holding the debt alone. Because she had co-signed their tax returns, the burden now belonged to her. Selling their 11,000 square foot mansion brought in $2.7 million, but most of that went straight to the mortgage. Outstanding bills kept surfacing: $2,000 owed for tuxedos, $3,500 for groceries, over $100,000 on a shopping center mortgage. Even Sammy's insurance payouts and any future royalties were redirected straight to the IRS. Legal battles dragged on for years. A settlement with the IRS came in 1997, but by that point, Altavice had lost nearly everything. Financial hardship became her daily reality, and her own struggle with alcohol only deepened the fall. The woman who had stood beside one of the most famous entertainers in the world found herself living in conditions that bore no resemblance to their former life. Then came the auction, and with it the final indignity. September of 1991, more than 1,800 people filled a Los Angeles auction house to bid on over 500 of Sammy's personal belongings. His gold record for the Candyman sold for just over $4,000. A pair of his tap shoes brought $11,000. Strangers walked out carrying his jewelry, hats, walking sticks, and scrapbooks under their arms. $439,000. That was the total. Against a $7 million debt, it barely registered. Altavice watched her husband's life leave the room one lot at a time. And not everything even made it to the auction block. 185 pieces of jewelry had vanished. An Andy Warhol painting was gone. Somebody had been busy. The storage locker. Which brings the story full circle to that storage unit in Burbank. Late 1991. Mark Hornick, a 28-year-old with no connection to Sammy Davis Jr. whatsoever, received an unexpected bill for $365 from A1 Self-Storage. The account had been opened using his stolen identity, filled with cash payments, and kept deliberately invisible. The storage company investigated the discrepancy. Fearing something criminal behind the door, the manager dialed the police. Officers arrived and pried the unit open. Sammy Davis Jr.'s personal life stared back at them from the shadows. A trumpet sat against the wall. An antique record player waited in the corner. A jukebox loaded with the Candyman stood collecting dust alongside boxes of clothing, stacks of documents, and bundles of photographs that had no business sitting in a rented locker under a fake name. Investigators traced the trail back to someone inside Altavisa's circle, an employee who had quietly moved the items into storage just 2 weeks after the auction. His explanation to investigators was straightforward. The IRS was coming for everything, and he was trying to save whatever scraps remained. A stolen identity and cash payments were supposed to keep the whole thing invisible. And honestly, the plan would have worked. If the monthly bills had kept arriving on time, nobody would have asked a single question, and that locker would have sat undisturbed for another 30 years. But the payments stopped, the storage company noticed, and the moment that door swung open, the last chapter of Sammy Davis Jr.'s story finished writing itself. The IRS seized everything inside. Altavise maintained that she had no knowledge of the storage unit or its contents. Whether that claim holds up is something nobody can answer with certainty. But the image lingers and refuses to let go. Sammy's most personal belongings hidden in a concrete box under a stranger's name in the dark. As if even in death, pieces of his life still needed to be kept secret. The man they couldn't erase. That thread of secrecy runs through his entire story when you step back and look at the full picture. Sammy Davis Jr. spent his whole life hiding parts of himself from a country that demanded he stay small. His Cuban roots stayed buried because America wouldn't accept them. His love for Kim Novak stayed hidden because America would destroy them both. His pain stayed masked behind a grin because the show always had to go on. And when he was gone, even his possessions ended up stashed in a storage locker, tucked away in darkness under a name that wasn't his. He gave this country everything a person can give. His childhood went to the stage. His left eye went to the road. His dignity went to audiences who cheered for him at night and told him he wasn't fit to sleep under the same roof come morning. His health went to the cigarettes that fueled those marathon nights. America took the talent, took the money, took the possessions, and returned just enough applause to keep him moving forward. But here is what nobody could take. They could not erase what Sammy Davis Jr. meant. The barriers he shattered in Las Vegas, on Broadway, in Hollywood, and on television stayed shattered. Every black entertainer who walked through those doors after him walked a path that Sammy had cleared with his own body. The music lived on after the man was gone. The performances survived on film and tape and in the memories of everyone who saw them. Sammy was not a perfect man, and pretending otherwise would dishonor the truth of his life. Reckless with money, careless at times with the people who loved him, lost for long stretches inside his own demons, he carried every flaw out in the open along with every gift. But he was brave in ways that most people will never be tested. He loved who he chose to love in a country that threatened to blind him for it. He stood with Dr. King when standing there could have cost him his career, his safety, and his life. He performed for audiences who adored his talent while despising his existence, and he did it night after night after night without flinching. When they pried open that vault after 30 years, what froze everyone in the room wasn't the trumpet, the jukebox, or the photographs. It was the realization that hit them all at once. The greatest entertainer America ever produced, a man who had filled stadiums and charmed presidents and broken down walls that nobody else had the courage to touch, ended up in a rented storage locker in Burbank, California, hidden under a fake name, paid for in stolen cash, forgotten by the country that owed him everything. That isn't just Sammy's story, that is America's story, and it is one that should never stop being told. If this moved you, pass it along. Share it with someone who remembers watching Sammy on television, and share it with someone who has never heard his name. The best way to honor a man who spent his entire life fighting to be seen is to make sure he stays visible long after the curtain comes down.